Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Ange Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're talking about my Week 16 waiver wire targets for the 2022 fantasy football season. Over the course of today's episode, we're going to be talking about prospects at the running back, wide receiver, tight end, quarterback, kicker, and defensive positions going into Week 16. Players that may give you guys a starting option, may give you guys a little bit of upside going into Week 16 in order to not only help you win this week, but hopefully by the end of the season, help you capture a 2022 fantasy football championship. Now, majority of the players that I do mention on today's episode are going to be rostered in less than 50% of Yahoo leagues. With a greater range of availability, you can go ahead, check your waiver wires. If in fact these players are available, pick them up and utilize them at your discretion. Again, majority of the players that we do mention on today's episode aren't going to have incredible track records. They're not going to be the most consistent of players. And in majority of the cases, they've either only recently had a breakout performance or are benefiting off of an injury that has taken place this last week or a couple weeks ago, which may end up giving them some value for this upcoming week, but it may not have as much longevity as we'd like. Either way, when we approach Week 16, for those of you who have gotten here, and again, the implication is if you're watching this video right now, you've made it to Week 16. Congratulations, you won either your first round of your playoffs and or you had a bye week and are advancing to the next round. Congratulations. It's not easy to get here, especially considering all the injuries, the inconsistency of play this year. One of the lowest scoring fantasy seasons of all time. Again, like I mentioned, it is not easy, so congratulations. But as we progress into Week 16, majority of the players that are going to be in our starting lineups are going to be studs. We want to play our studs, but for those of you who are dealing with a lack of consistency, depth on your team, and or injuries that took place on Sunday, guys like Jonathan Taylor, of course, on Thursday of last week, we saw Tyler Lockett don't go down with an injury. There are players that are going to be missing from our lineups, and if in fact we can address those positional needs to helping you win this upcoming week and of course a 2022 fantasy football championship, that is the goal. Now, before we get into today's content, I want to remind you guys, for those of you who have not yet already, be sure to subscribe to the channel. We're making daily fantasy football content for the entirety of the 2022 season. Again, for those of you who continue to come out, click the like button. With your viewership, continue to support the channel. I cannot thank you guys enough. Again, if I've helped you advance to your Week 16 fantasy playoffs, I'm glad I can help in any single way. But again, you guys are the final decision makers. I'm just here to give you guys as much information as possible so that you can make the right decisions at the end of the week. Outside of that, again, we're making fantasy football content up until Week 18. So for those of you who are trapped in a Week 18 championship, I'll be here to help. Nonetheless, be sure to subscribe. Also, later tonight, I will not be live streaming after the Monday Night Football game. I have typically done that over the course of the season. Again, this is a very much so condensed week because there are 10 games on Saturday, on Christmas Eve. So for many of us, we need our information a little bit earlier. At least in my position, I'm going to be doing a lot of research this week, so I want to get a little bit of a leg up on it tonight. Now, speaking of the Monday Night Football game, for those of you who want to continue to play daily fantasy, again, you can check out PrizePicks. Tonight's game between the Los Angeles Rams and, of course, Green Bay Packers has a lot of potential in it. Again, currently via PrizePicks, they have the promotion of the 12 Days of Pickmas. If you haven't checked them out already, there's a link down in the description. When you use promo code Andrew today to sign up and make that first-time deposit, your first-time deposit is immediately doubled when using promo code Andrew up to $100. So check that out today. I'll be putting together a couple PrizePick entries at the end of today's episode in regards to some of the promotions, specifically today's December 19th promotion is the holiday sweater party. If you go ahead and travel to PrizePicks, there are players that have holiday sweaters on. Those players, if they're put into an entry together, will get an advanced multiplier in terms of their potential playout of said entry. So be sure to take advantage of that today. Thank you very much. Again, link is down in the description. All right, let's talk about Week 16 waiver wire targets. Let's begin with our number one. It is Zack Moss. Now, the primary reason Zack Moss is in this scenario is because of the injury to Jonathan Taylor. Quite literally, on the first touch of that Saturday game, Jonathan Taylor goes down with the high ankle sprain, and the likelihood of him potentially missing the remainder of the year is extremely high, especially considering the fact that the Colts have a losing record, most likely will not be making the playoffs, and even though they are technically still in the hunt within their own division, I'm expecting them to shut down Jonathan Taylor based on the longevity of this injury and the fact that it could continue to bother him for the remainder of the year. They want him healthy for the future. This is not a season where they believe they can win a Super Bowl. I'm expecting them to shut him down. So if that's the case, Zack Moss would be the number one potential option of this backfield that is going to benefit. Currently only rostered in 2% of leagues on Yahoo, I expect Zack Moss to have a lot of potential, primarily because of the matchups on hand. In the next 2 weeks, he takes on the Los Angeles Chargers and the New York Giants. Those are two of the three best overall matchups you could possibly ask for at the running back position in terms of fantasy points allowed over the course of the last 2 months. Outside of the Houston Texans, the Los Angeles Chargers and the New York Giants are the next two worst teams in terms of going up against opposing running backs and giving up a lot of statistics, to say the very least. So Zack Moss is definitely in a beneficial position. Even though Deon Jackson is going to be in this backfield, let's look at what happened on Saturday. Zack Moss dominated 67% of the offensive snaps while also dominating 65% of the running back rushing attempts in that game. 24 rushing attempts in comparison to Deon Jackson's 13. And even though Deon Jackson was slightly more efficient with his opportunity, I believe that a lot of Zack Moss's rushing attempts late in that game were just, hey, let's just roll him up the middle, try to kill as much clock rather than scheming him to succeed. This upcoming week, it'll be a little bit different in my mind. So besides the fact that we have the potential of Deon Jackson kind of looming and taking some value away from Zack Moss and his potential on a given weekly basis, you got to remember that late in that game, Deon Jackson did fumble. And after he fumbled, we didn't see him for the remainder of the game. I'm expecting Zack Moss to be the primary number one. Throughout the course of his career, the 3 years from 2020 through 2021, whenever he has been given 13 or more touches, he's averaging 11.12 fantasy points per game and a half PPR scoring format. Why I picked number 13, we'll talk about when we get to the Deon Jackson section of today's video. But either way, Zack Moss, absolutely the number one waiver wire pickup of the week. Moving on to our number 2, we have Tyler Allgeier. Now, Tyler Allgeier is coming off of an incredible week of 22.1 fantasy points. We talked about him last week in the potential of Tyler Allgeier having a little bit of a transition of this offense going from Marcus Mariota to Desmond Ridder and from Cordero Patterson to Tyler Allgeier. And we did witness that, but not at the capacity that we expected. It wasn't a matter of, hey, we're trying to get younger and we're trying to give more experience to these younger rookies, but rather, hey, Tyler Allgeier is just really playing well. Feed the hot hand. And that's exactly what happened, because over the course of the last month, we've continuously witnessed Tyler Allgeier get about 9 to 11 rushing attempts per game out of his backfield. It has been a committee. But the fact that he came out and was so dominant, put together a performance in which thus far this season, it's the second most rushing attempts a running back has had for the Atlanta Falcons this season. And over the course of the year, we have seen the Atlanta Falcons average 25.86 rushing attempts per game. So 17 of them going in his direction. Of course, the remainder going to Cordero Patterson and a couple sprinkles to Caleb Huntley. Certainly does give us a little bit more hope that Tyler Allgeier will continue to maintain this spot. But when I say that he was given an opportunity, but it wasn't a transitionary period, it primarily had to do with the fact that he didn't have himself a rushing attempt for the entirety of that first quarter. And it wasn't until late in that second quarter in which they really began to work him like a workhorse back. Now, primarily when there was 3 minutes and 18 seconds left in that second quarter, for the remainder of that game, since that time mark, that timestamp, for the remainder of that game, he had 17 of his 19 total touches. Overall, pretty good opportunity, which also includes his 2-point conversion, which was a success. Now, since week 9, we have seen Tyler Allgeier be a far more efficient back in comparison to earlier this year. Obviously, due to the thanks to his offensive line and, of course, the tight ends, fullbacks that block for this team. But over the course of the last couple weeks, since week 9, 64 rushing attempts for 419 rushing yards, a 6.55 yard per carry average in an offense that has succeeded against everyone. And for those of you who have, the potential of picking up Tyler Allgeier and utilizing him in the upcoming weeks, the Baltimore Ravens matchup this week is difficult. I will give you that. But the fact of the matter is, Atlanta has ran on every single defense this season at a minimum of 74 rushing yards from their running backs every single game. So it doesn't matter who they're taking on, they're going to find success. In fact, thus far this season, the Atlanta Falcons running backs have surpassed 100 plus rushing yards in 10 of their 14 games. That's a 71.4% success rate. I'm expecting Tyler Allgeier to get himself more and more utilization. Even though this is a difficult matchup against the Baltimore Ravens, we have seen, of course, Nick Chubb coming off a week where he had 99 rushing yards. It's not out of the realm of possibility that Tyler Allgeier can be relevant and certainly a top 36 running back option. Outside of that, the following week in week 17, the fantasy championship weekend, takes on Arizona, which in my opinion would make him a top 24 play if he continues at this level of opportunity and capacity. Let's move on to the final running back option. We have Deon Jackson. Like I was mentioning before, Deon Jackson is certainly going to impede on the overall upside of a Zack Moss within a given week, especially considering the upcoming matchups against the Los Angeles Chargers and New York Giants, which are going to be run heavy for the Indianapolis Colts offense. Currently, Deon Jackson only rostered in 7% of leagues. For those of you who are, of course, handcuffing Jonathan Taylor, probably didn't do as good of a job as you could have, considering his lack of rostership at this current moment in time. But I do want to mention a couple things. This season, in weeks 5, 6, 9, and 15, the 4 weeks in which we have seen ample opportunity go in Deon Jackson's direction, he has put up 11.1, 23.1, 4.6, and 10.1 fantasy points. 3 out of those 4 weeks, 10 or more fantasy points when given ample opportunity. We could see that this upcoming week. And if in fact that's going to be the case, he should absolutely be a top 36 running back option because of the opportunity on hand. That being said, late in the game, fumbled. Chandon Sullivan picked it up. It was an early whistle, and eventually it led to that game just completely being a mess, eventually forcing it to overtime. But as soon as Deon Jackson late in the fourth quarter fumbled, he did not receive a single attempt and or opportunity for the remainder of that game, which is very much so telling as to where they kind of have him within the hierarchy of this backfield, expecting Zack Moss to be the number one, but Deon Jackson could certainly have top 36 value. All right, let's move on and let's talk about wide receivers. Beginning with our number one, it is Marquise Goodwin. The wide receiver of the Seattle Seahawks, in my mind, absolutely needs to be addressed, because if in fact we're going to witness Tyler Lockett miss 1 to 2 games here with the broken index finger, that could play a part in Marquise Goodwin getting more opportunity. This upcoming week, they take on the Kansas City Chiefs defense. We just saw the last 2 weeks, the Denver Broncos and Houston Texans really push the Kansas City Chiefs to their absolute limit. We have seen, some of the worst teams in the National Football League really put up great numbers offensively against the Kansas City Chiefs defense. So why not Geno Smith along with DK Metcalf and Marquise Goodwin? It wasn't just long ago that we saw Marquise Goodwin put together a great performance. You go back to week 14, 5 catches on 6 targets, 95 receiving yards, and a receiving touchdown. That's literally 2 weeks ago, where he had 17.8 half PPR fantasy points. In the 3 games this season where Marquise Goodwin has been given enough opportunity to garner 4 or more receptions, in those 3 games, 17.8, 20.7, and 5.3. 2 pretty good performances. And with potentially Tyler Lockett absent this week, Marquise Goodwin a pretty good option. Let's move on to KJ Osborn, our number 2. I'm a little bit hesitant on the potential of KJ Osborn, despite the fact that he's coming off of a week where he had 16 total targets, an identical number as Justin Jefferson in week 15. He had 10 catches, 157 and a touchdown, 26.7 fantasy points. In a game in which they were down 33-0 at one point. Of course, they threw for the remainder of that game. So obviously we were going to see a lot more targets attributed in the direction of these receiving targets. But the fact of the matter is, KJ Osborn has been relevant in fantasy for 2 consecutive weeks here. Besides this last week, back in week 14, 5 targets, 5 catches, 38 yards, a receiving touchdown, 12.3 fantasy points. He's continuing to build trust within this offense with, of course, Kirk Cousins to get himself into a position where maybe he could be the number 2 receiving option of this offense going forward if, in fact, a TJ Hawkinson and or an Adam Thielen are going to step up accordingly. With that being said, I think KJ Osborn in this offense, typically in terms of the hierarchy of targets, it goes Justin Jefferson, number 2 is TJ Hawkinson, number 3, Adam Thielen, number 4, it's either a toss-up between KJ Osborn and typically Dalvin Cook. So with so much target competition, it is difficult to trust him, but this could be an opportunity for KJ Osborn to earn more work within this offense and potentially be fantasy relevant for the future. Let's move on to the number 3 option here at wide receiver. We have Jahan Dotson, the rookie wide receiver, coming off another big week. We mentioned him last week as a guy that, actually we mentioned him the last 2 weeks as someone that you want to have on roster, considering he is getting more and more opportunity within this offense. Coming off a performance last night, 4 catches for 105 and a touchdown, 18.5 fantasy points. A couple weeks back prior to the bye week against the New York Giants as well, he took on them, 5 catches, 54, and a touchdown. In the last 2 games, 15 total targets. That level of opportunity, the fact that he's been able to score touchdowns, put up great fantasy point contributions for our teams, leads me to believe that, again, you could trust them this upcoming week, potentially. They do take on the San Francisco 49ers, which we know leads to the fact that Brian Robinson and or Antonio Gibson will not be relevant in the running game. We know that last night, Taylor Heineke was running for his life, and there's a potential in which, of course, Nick Bosa is going to get after him, and that's going to be the case. That certainly will be difficult, but Jahan Dotson could be a fantastic option if, in fact, the Washington Commanders are only throwing for the remainder of that game. All right, let's move on into talking about the rest of the wide receiver position. Continuing with our number 4, we have Chris Moore of the Houston Texans. Now, even though I had a lot more hope that Chris Moore would find upside, the opportunity was there. Let's not get it twisted here. 9 total targets on Sunday against the Kansas City Chiefs, only 4 catches for 42. But again, in the last 2 games, 20 total targets, 14 receptions, over 160 receiving yards. When we're in a conversation in which he's getting himself over 10 yards per reception on average over the course of the last 2 weeks, garnering an opportunity rate of 10 targets per game on average over the course of the last 2 games, I'm expecting to see continuous success potentially from Chris Moore if, in fact, we will continue to see the absence of Nico Collins and Brandon Cooks within this offense. Going forward, they do take on the Tennessee Titans this upcoming week. It's a really good run-stopping defense, which will, of course, force Davis Mills to pass the ball. Davis Mills wasn't efficient, but he got the job done at the end of the day, and hopefully will continue to look in the direction of Chris Moore. Let's move on to our number 5. We have Mack Hollins. Mack Hollins, again, even with the return of a Darren Waller and or Hunter Renfrow, Mack Hollins is still going to be the number 2 receiving option within this offense. It is clear as day. Coming away with 8 targets, 4 catches, 40 yards, and a touchdown on Sunday. has an opportunity of taking on the Pittsburgh Steelers this week. As long as we continue to see the Raiders refuse to funnel target Davante Adams, and more opportunities are going to be going in the direction of a Mack Hollins, going up against a Steelers secondary that has struggled against wide receivers in terms of coverage this season, should be a fantastic potential play going into this given week. Let's move on to Mecole Hardman. Mecole Hardman should be coming off the injured reserve. He is in that window where he could be designated to return. There's not a guarantee. Another reminder again, guys, they take on the Seattle Seahawks defense. It is an advantageous matchup to say the very least, especially from a receiver that is going to get himself a lot of work out of the backfield and or as a slot receiving option who also has the ability to take a top off the defense. He's just a touchdown machine. His level of production prior to his injury in the last 4 games from weeks 5 through 9, 16.15 half PPR fantasy points per game, having scored 5 touchdowns in those 4 games. Potential upside there if he's available. Moving on to Russell Gage, our number 7. So Russell Gage benefited primarily because there wasn't a Julio Jones active in Sunday's game. But if in fact Julio Jones is going to continue to miss time because of said injury, this could lend more and more opportunity towards Russell Gage, who came away with 12 targets, 8 catches, 59 yards, and 2 receiving touchdowns. Again, both of them in the red zone in which he was able to find himself open. One on a corner route, which was absolutely beautiful. Overall, I think if Tom Brady in this offense is going to continue to trend towards scoring more, whether it's in garbage time or early in that game, it does not matter. I'm expecting Russell Gage, if in fact there is no Julio Jones, to potentially have more value going into this upcoming week's matchup. Let's move on to Noah Brown. Now, despite the fact that many of us expected either Michael Gallup and or someone like CeeDee Lamb, Dalton Schultz to be the primary receiving option in this offense, it was Noah Brown this week. There's a lot of inconsistency. Again, a lot of unpredictability that is in fantasy football that in many circumstances is tough to see. You know, Noah Brown coming away with 9 targets, 6 catches, 49 yards, and a 2 touchdown game on a play in which Dak Prescott boots away from the run, is rolling out to the sideline. Dalton Schultz is wide open for a touchdown. In fact, throws it back across his body towards Noah Brown. It doesn't make any sense. Dalton Schultz wide open, should have been a touchdown. Either way, Noah Brown currently rostered in 2% of leagues, along with some of these other guys who are rostered in like 13, 29, 19%, 17%, a wide range of availability. Let's move on to the final wide receiver option I wanted to mention going into this week. It is Isaiah Hodgins. We mentioned him last week. They take on the Minnesota Vikings this upcoming week. If in fact we're going to continue to see Isaiah Hodgins have a major role as an outside receiving primary threat, going up against the Minnesota Vikings, that is primarily where they've struggled as a defense. We could potentially see a pretty big week here from Isaiah Hodgins, assuming that this offense wants to throw the ball, unlike the way that, of course, Matt Ryan and the Indianapolis Colts approached that game after they maintained a pretty decent lead there. I honestly believe they should have kept throwing the ball. Either way, let's move on to the next position. Let's talk about some quarterbacks. Number 1, it is Brock Purdy. Here's the thing. Brock Purdy has demonstrated over the last 3 consecutive weeks that he can be trusted in fantasy. In the last 2 starts, 16.48 and 21.7. In the last 3 consecutive games, 2 or more passing touchdowns. As long as he continues to be as consistent he has been, the receiving threats that surround him, hopefully a healthy Deebo Samuel upcoming here, maybe in week 17, I'm expecting Brock Purdy to continue to be a relevant option going up against the Washington Commanders this upcoming week. Let's move on to Kenny Pickett. Again, this is if in fact you are super desperate for a quarterback play. Kenny Pickett takes on the Las Vegas Raiders defense. They have been one of the worst in the league. That is a given. And I do not expect Kenny Pickett to play as bad as Mac Jones did on Sunday. So with that being said, Kenny Pickett, with his offense and hopefully back from the concussion protocol, could be a decent option. The final player we want to mention is Zach Wilson. The indication that we've been given from the media and or the organization of the New York Jets is that Mike White is most likely going to miss another consecutive week, even though he has seen double-digit doctors in terms of trying to get himself cleared from the rib injury. They have a short week. They play on Thursday against Jacksonville. Likelihood is that, of course, Zach Wilson will be available and the starter going into the given week, which, again, you got to be pretty desperate to play. Now, let's talk about tight ends. In this current circumstance, you don't have to be desperate to play these players because they have been incredible over the course of the last couple weeks here. Beginning with Juwan Johnson, currently only rostered in 20% of leagues. We mentioned him on Thursday's tight end video, as if, in fact, he's going to play, should be a great option. And that's exactly what he was. Had himself 20.7 fantasy points with 2 receiving touchdowns. Takes on Cleveland this upcoming week. I just wanted to mention a couple statistics in regards to Juwan Johnson's season thus far. Since week 7, Andy Dalton has thrown 13 touchdowns, while Juwan Johnson has been active and healthy. Of those 13 touchdowns, 7 have gone in the direction of Juwan Johnson. 5 of those 7 Juwan Johnson touchdowns down in the red zone. Andy Dalton this season, since week 7, with Juwan Johnson active and healthy, has only thrown 8 touchdowns down in the red zone. So 5 of those 8 touchdowns in the direction of Juwan Johnson. When they get down into the red zone, there's only one man that's going to catch the ball. And quite frankly, it has already been determined that it's going to be Juwan Johnson. Going into this upcoming weekend's matchup against Cleveland, I'm expecting some success. And of course, hopefully a touchdown from Juwan Johnson for our fantasy teams. Let's move on to our number 2. We have Chigoziem Okonkwo. Now, many of us were worried about his overall potential in the given week as soon as we saw Ryan Tannehill carted off the field. Ryan Tannehill came back into that game and was able to allow Chigoziem Okonkwo to accumulate 4 catches on 5 targets for 54 receiving yards. A pretty decent week for a tight end in a half PPR scoring format. But ultimately, we want more upside. We want touchdowns to potentially be attributed to his overall scoreline. Unfortunately, they weren't able to take advantage of it. This upcoming week, they take on the Houston Texans. Again, anybody can score against Houston. Hopefully, Chigoziem Okonkwo will have a healthy Ryan Tannehill ready to go, because that'll certainly help his overall upside. Let's move on to the final tight end I wanted to mention. It is Noah Fant. Again, like I mentioned with Marquise Goodwin earlier, if we are in a conversation this week in which Tyler Lockett is not available, Noah Fant should see more target opportunity going up against the Kansas City Chiefs, a team that he is very much so familiar with, having taken them on over the course of his career when he was with the Denver Broncos, and in fact, found himself a fair share of success. Either way, if the targets continue to go in his direction, could be another relevant fantasy option at the tight end position, which again, there aren't many of. Let's move on to kickers and special team defensive positions. Beginning with our number 1, it is Chase McLaughlin. We talked about him last week on Friday in terms of putting together a PrizePick entry. The man literally had 5 field goals made in that game, put up 21 fantasy points, but over the course of the last 5 games has put up 21, 9, 7, 12, and 9. Pretty good overall production, especially for those of you who are in desperate need of a kicker. Currently only rostered in 6% of Yahoo leagues. Moving on to the second kicker I wanted to mention, it is Eddie Pinheiro. Eddie Pinheiro, in the last 5 games, 12, 13, 12, 3, and 16. Double-digit fantasy points, 12 plus in 4 out of the last 5 games. Only rostered in 2% of leagues. Guys, we got to start paying attention to kickers like this because they can absolutely not only win you a week, but a fantasy football championship if they continue to score points at this volume, going up against Detroit this upcoming week. Moving on to the final option of kicker, it is Joey Sly. Like I mentioned last week, Joey Sly continues to get himself a lot of opportunity and produce with said opportunity, having put up 9, 9, 8, 12, and 19 in the last 5 weeks, currently only rostered in 2% of leagues. Let's move on to potential defenses for week 16. Beginning with our number 1, it is the Tennessee Titans. They are currently only rostered in 48% of leagues, and they take on the Houston Texans. It is an automatic start, plug and play. Hopefully the secondary and this defense will step up. Majority of this game is going to consist of Derrick Henry running for 200 yards and 3 touchdowns. But when in fact the Tennessee Titans are on defense, they should hopefully be able to force a lot of turnovers and a little bit of uncomfortability in the pocket for Davis Mills. Moving on to the Cincinnati Bengals, who in the second half were a completely different defense. Even with all the injuries that they have sustained, they've continued to stay relevant and, of course, get themselves in a situation where they're causing turnovers. They did exactly that. Fumbles, interceptions, sacks, all of that accumulating to a pretty good week for the Cincinnati Bengals on Sunday. Either way, they do take on the New England Patriots. Mac Jones has looked terrible this season. I'm primarily going to blame, of course, the offensive coaching, the coordinator and all that kind of jazz. But going forward, Cincinnati's a pretty good option in the given week. Moving on to the final option at defense, it is the Detroit Lions. Yes, that is a fact. We are mentioning the Detroit Lions defense for the first time maybe in my entire history of fantasy football content here on YouTube. I don't know if I've ever mentioned the Detroit Lions in terms of a defense that you have to play. Well, this upcoming week against Carolina, it is the case. They're currently only rostered in 4% of leagues and could be a pretty good option. All right. Now with all that covered in terms of waiver wire targets, let's go ahead and let's put together some PrizePick entries for later tonight's game between the Los Angeles Rams and, of course, Green Bay Packers, and hopefully get you guys some stocking stuffers in regards to this week. Of course, the holiday season is just upon us, so let's check that out today in terms of the 12 days of Pickmas. So as you guys can see to the right of me, we are here via PrizePicks for Monday Night Football. Now, I'm going to go ahead and put together some entries for tonight in regards to some potential plays in which either they have a sweater on or perhaps they don't. I want to go ahead and make an entry first and foremost in terms of players that do not have sweaters. I would like to go ahead and play more on the given player statistic of 44.5 receiving yards for Christian Watson tonight. I'm taking more on that given number. I think in terms of all the potential plays, considering he's been able to do this on a consistent rate over the course of the last 4 weeks, of course, mentioning the fact that he has been one of the most explosive players over the course of the last month in terms of fantasy football, having scored 8 touchdowns in those 4 games. I think that 44 or at least 45 receiving yards in this given contest is not a difficult task at hand. I think he could very easily accomplish that number. Now, when I look at the rest of the overall statistics in tonight's game, again, I think, 3 receptions for Van Jefferson is not a difficult number to accomplish. It shouldn't be, at least. Why would that be something difficult? I understand he's coming off a week where he only had 2 catches, but it was also in a game in which Baker Mayfield was on a plane 48 hours prior trying to learn the playbook. I think there's a very good chance that the reception totals of these guys could very easily go over. So I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to put together this entry of Christian Watson and Justin Jefferson, both going more on their given player statistics. Again, I'm just going to put a little bit of a sprinkle on it because we want to put together multiple entries. We'll put this in and move on to the next entry. Now, in terms of the next entry, like I mentioned, I want to put a couple sprinkles in terms of NBA players. We're going to go ahead. We're taking Zion Williamson, picking more on his overall points today. Again, the guy's been extremely consistent as late. Takes on Milwaukee. He's going to have to put up a lot of points if they want to continue to compete. I also like the potential of Lauri Markkanen as of tonight going more than 19.5 points. So we're going to go ahead, put together an entry there. But I also want to include it with a little bit of an NFL kind of sprinkle. I think there is a very high likelihood, again, of this number of 44.5 receiving yards, this specifically hitting. So we're going to go ahead, put together a 3-leg entry for tonight in regards to these three given players, making it a power play for the given week and hoping for some success. All right, well, that's going to cover it for me today. Again, if you guys want to go ahead and put together some entries, be sure to check out PrizePicks. There's a link down in the description. Be sure to use promo code Andrew. Do not forget, if you go ahead and take advantage of tonight's PrizePick potential entry of holiday sweater party, where you go ahead, put together some entries with some players that are wearing some sweaters, whether it is an Aaron Jones and an Aaron Rodgers, Cam Akers is also available there. You can go ahead and get an extra multiplier on your potential entry for tonight. If you're interested, be sure to use promo code Andrew in the link down in the description when you make that first time deposit. Thank you very much. Outside of that, I'll see you guys tomorrow for our top 36 running back rankings for week 16. And until next time, I'll see you guys. Peace.